I'm not going to do anything except introduce today's introducer and moderator for today's session. That's Westmont historian Mahian Robbins, who I mentioned last night as a part of the faculty organizing committee. Thank you, Mahian, for your work on that. And take it away, please.
So I'm particularly excited to introduce Dr. Lynn Hunt to you because there's three reasons. Because we have a lot in common. Because she's a historian. Because she does French history. And because she also writes a lot on historical methods, and that's my favorite topic to teach. We're practically twins. That's where it stops, really, because Lynn Hunt is also the kind of historian whose books are on every historian's bookshelves. And because I needed evidence to say that, I brought evidence. And I went to all of my colleagues' offices and looked at their books, and I found 4. Some of my colleagues don't know how to organize their library. I found 4. So, and it's really true that many historians read her work, and it's very helpful, not just in terms of her research, but for teaching as well. Lynn Hunt has published in a number of areas in the area of the French Revolution. She published, I love this title, Family Romance in the French Revolution. How can you connect family romance and French Revolution? Doesn't seem to go together, but she did it. And then she also published in the area of historical methods a large number of books, and then recently also turned to the area of global history, which is also helpful for us teaching world history. So without any further delay, Lynn Hunt.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I've already learned an amazing amount during today. And thank you for being willing to be here at 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday. If we did something at UCLA at Friday afternoon at 4:30, I would be the only person in the room if I was giving the talk. So I really appreciate that. And also, I am extremely happy to learn about Westmont College, which is beautiful, and also it has amazing students and faculty and staff, whom I have to thank especially for helping organize my coming here. It may not seem far away from Los Angeles, but in rainstorms, it seems further away. But I went to a small liberal arts college myself, and it's an incredible privilege, it turns out, to go to a small liberal arts college. So if any of you are students, cherish these moments, because they'll be very hard to reproduce in the rest of your life. They're still some of the most important moments in my life, and that was a long time ago for me compared to today's students. And it's also a privilege to teach students in a kind of environment where you get to actually know their names and their faces and get a sense of how they're thinking about problems so that you can learn from them as much as they can learn from you. I am not going to talk a super long time. I did write out what I wanted to say specifically because I get carried away, and I'd rather get carried away at the end answering questions than to get carried away and take up too much time. So I will stick pretty much to my text. Let me begin by making my position clear. I do not believe that knowledge is in crisis, nor do I believe that we find ourselves in a post-truth age. The only sense in which knowledge is in crisis is this: there is too much of it for any one person to comprehend, and so we rely on interpreters, which means there is inevitably room for doubt about the interpretations offered. This has been true for centuries already, so there is no new and immediate crisis of knowledge. From the moment printing took root in the West, scholars began complaining of the overabundance of books. They would not have imagined the overabundance we now face. This is just, because I love these kinds of things. Just to give you an idea of the massivity of what is being published. This is, of course, all areas, and this is just the beginning of the list of countries, and there are all kinds of interesting things that one could do with this, which I am not going to do. Truth has also always been at issue, even, for example, in Western Europe, when Christianity was the only sanctioned religion, and the Catholic Church claimed an exclusive right to interpret truths, both divine and profane. Like knowledge, truth has a history. The fracturing of Christianity in the 16th century created new pressures on truth and on the question of who had the authority to proclaim it. And the rise of science, which we've been talking about a fair amount, as an alternative standard of truth from the 1600s to our day, produced a whole new set of questions about truth. We are still navigating those questions. What makes the question of truth so troubling in our time is not simply the rise of authoritarian figures who use lying with impunity as a means of displaying their power. It is rather the broader problem of democracy and the difficulty that humans have experienced since the 17th century in fashioning alternatives to what I call, very generally and vaguely, absolutism. For those of us in French history, this has a very concrete meaning, the absolutism of the 17th century, but I want to use it more generally. Whether that is absolutism in politics, in the form of rulers by supposed divine right, or absolutism in religion, in the form of belief systems that demand blind obedience, or absolutism in knowledge, in the form of authorities, whether religious or political, who claim a special purchase on truth. Giving up absolutism turns out to be harder than many thought. Truth based on probabilities and inevitably partial knowledge, that is, truth that is provisional, is much less emotionally satisfying than absolute truth. Because absolutism has penetrated our intellectual DNA as a result of centuries of experience with it, the provisional truths of science, history, and politics always seem to fall short, precisely because they do not make absolute claims. I will argue that democracy depends on this notion of provisional truth, on the idea that we can do better, and at the same time must accept the imperfections of what we have done. Like truth, democracy is a process, not a final result. I am not denying that the rise of the internet and social media have made discerning the truth more difficult. Practically the most recent issue of Science magazine has this on its cover. A recent article in that issue argues for more study of fake news, something we've been talking about, citing the erosion of public trust in mass media and the uncomfortable facts, for instance, that between 9 and 15% of all Twitter accounts are bots, and that false information on Twitter is more often retweeted than true information. The internet poses new challenges to determining the truth. In one of our sessions just now, talked about this at some length. It does not, however, do away with the notion of truth, much as some might like that to be the case. Similarly, I do not want to deny the difficulty of convincing people of the truth. Take the example of Holocaust denial. Marianne is now very much interested in the study of the Holocaust. Despite repeated refutations based on mountains of documentation, and despite the exemplary official and non-official German efforts to come to terms with those crimes, Holocaust denial still percolates across Europe and the rest of the world, often via social media such as Facebook. It receives robust support at the highest levels of some Middle Eastern governments, and not just Iran, that find it useful as part of an anti-Israel policy. Denials of the Holocaust, however far-fetched or unsubstantiated, have had their effect. An international survey conducted in late 2013 and early 2014, this is the graph here, showed that among people living in the Middle East and North Africa, only 1/5 of those who had heard of the Holocaust believed that historical accounts of it were accurate. Even in Western Europe, where 94% of the population had heard of the Holocaust, only 77% believed accounts of it were accurate. The link between democracy and truth is perhaps most evident, however, in debates over national history. In the 19th and even much of the 20th century, now here, let's say I'm being schematic, in the 19th and even much of the 20th century for all of the world, most national histories, especially those prepared for school children, emphasized the positive in a nation's history as part of enhancing national belonging. In the 20th century, history textbooks came under pressure almost everywhere in the world, sooner or later. The pressure sometimes came from the outside. One Japanese candidate for governor of Tokyo in 2015 insisted that, to quote him, "As a defeated nation, we only teach the history forced on us by the victors." He continued, "To be an independent nation, again, we must move away from the history imposed on us." He argued Japan was not the aggressor in World War II, did not invade Korea, did not commit the notorious massacre at Nanjing, China in 1937, and did not force Korean women to serve as comfort women, otherwise known as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. The controversy was not new. 10 years before, in 2005, Chinese and Korean demonstrators protested revisions in a textbook prepared by the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform. Claiming that it minimized Japanese culpability for World War II, demonstrators burned Japanese flags and demanded a boycott of Japanese goods. Public and political reactions against the revision of textbooks are especially dramatic in the United States, but they have occurred in other countries as well. The French legislature passed a law in 2005 that insisted that schools teach the positive role played by French colonial administrations. It was later abrogated in some embarrassment. A study of French textbooks used since 1998 shows that in fact such books still systematically downplay the violence and racism of French colonial administrations in Africa. In the United Kingdom, historians now draw attention to the way previous textbooks marginalized the Welsh, Scots, and Irish, treating them as bit players in an overwhelmingly English story. Moreover, popular histories of Britain routinely referred to our empire as a way of cementing empire as a part of British identity. Historians' recent focus in the UK on the downside of empire is only beginning to influence opinion. A YouGov survey found that 3 times as many Britons felt the empire was something to be proud of than ashamed of, and more than 3 times as many believed that countries colonized by Britain were better off as a result rather than worse off. It is worth noting, however, that young people held much more critical views of empire than older people. Nothing compares, however, to the culture wars set off by proposed textbook reforms in the US. In 1994, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum proposed an exhibition of the plane that had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and planned to include references to the debate about whether dropping the bomb was morally and politically justified. The same year, a federally funded National Center for the Study of History in the Schools, which happened to be located at UCLA, proposed national history standards that reflected the new social histories of workers, women, slaves, and immigrants that had been gaining steam since the 1960s. An outpouring of fury greeted both. Senate Majority Leader and future presidential candidate Robert Dole complained that educators and professors were engaged in what he called a shocking campaign to disparage America. Columnist George Will denounced what he called the cranky anti-Americanism of the campuses, and Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich maintained that most Americans are, in his words, sick and tired of being told by a cultural elite that they ought to be ashamed of their country, end quote. The Smithsonian removed almost all of the supposedly objectionable materials, and the national history standards were withdrawn, but historians continued to revise the long accepted narratives. One might even argue that recent political events in the U.S. reflect an ongoing dispute over the interpretation of national history. The Republican National Committee passed a resolution in August 2014 condemning a newly released framework for advanced placement high school courses in United States history, claiming that it, quote, reflects a radically revisionist view of American history that emphasizes negative aspects of our nation's history while omitting or minimizing positive aspects, unquote. In 2015, a state representative in Oklahoma introduced a bill to require the state's Board of Education to reject the new framework and teach instead certain foundational documents that included Magna Carta, the Ten Commandments, and the speeches of Ronald Reagan. The lawmaker was a member of the Black Robe Regiment, which according to its own website is a network for teaching, quote, our biblical responsibility to stand up for our Lord and Savior and to protect the freedoms and liberties granted to a moral people in the divinely inspired U.S. Constitution, end quote. The bill was withdrawn after it generated withering criticism, but repeated complaints prompted a revision of the high school framework to put more emphasis on American exceptionalism and on the Founding Fathers. The politicians won various of these skirmishes, but I would argue the historians won the culture war because they had the evidence to support their new interpretations. No United States history textbook can be published today that neglects the long history of slavery, the discrimination against women and minorities, or the contribution of immigrants to the building of the nation. Textbooks are not the only subject of controversy. The conflicts over historical monuments and the recovery of historical memories and the remarkable proliferation of truth commissions across the globe show that questions of historical truth are more crucial than ever to national identities. Moreover, such disputes are often directly related to the push for democratization. So I want to make a link between truth and democracy. Monuments are not just an issue in the U.S. Like students at Yale University who wanted to change the name of Calhoun College because it was named after a pro-slavery politician, students at Oxford campaigned for the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes because he was a racist and arch-imperialist. These tame versions of proposed monument removal pale next to those that have rocked countless places in turmoil. After the defeat of Hitler, we will remember, the Allies ordered the immediate destruction of all Nazi symbols. After the fall of the Soviet Union, crowds tore down Lenin and Stalin monuments from Ukraine to Ethiopia. A bronze statue of Saddam Hussein was dismantled in 2003 during the US-led invasion. In 2008, the last statue in Spain of the dictator Franco was removed. And to go back more than 2 centuries earlier, a few days after the promulgation of the Declaration of Independence, New Yorkers pulled down a gilded equestrian statue of King George III. It is only by thinking historically and gathering evidence that we can begin to discriminate between necessary monumental removal and vandalism. The term vandalism was invented during the French Revolution by revolutionaries themselves who wanted to distinguish between royal and ecclesiastical reminders that should be suppressed as part of founding a republic and those that should be put in museums as showcases for the national patrimony. The National Museum was invented by those same French revolutionaries at the same time as a way of turning those reminders of oppression into symbols of national pride. This tension between reminders of oppression and a nation's artistic patrimony continues to bedevil our discussions today. I do not pretend to offer a resolution to these issues. I'm not going to take a stand unless you press me on the statue of Robert E. Lee. But I do argue that historical research, documentation, and evidence is crucial to public deliberation about them. And in fact, there's very interesting research being done on that statue and many others of Robert E. Lee. The recovery of historical memories has proved to be particularly important to the establishment of more democratic forms of government. Until the Spanish military dictator Francisco Franco died in 1975, it was impossible to seriously research the killings that took place during the Civil War of 1936 to 1939, much less exhume the bodies of Republicans maligned as Reds who had been killed without trial and buried in unmarked graves. In the 1980s, the empirical work of historical reconstruction began. But not until 2000 was an association for the recovery of historical memory formed to exhume, identify, and rebury bodies. Attention has turned in recent years to the lost children, those who died in prison, were sent to state institutions, or had their names changed so that they could be illegally adopted by regime families. Memorialization has proved more difficult in Indonesia, for example, where as many as 500,000 communists were killed after an abortive coup in 1965. The general who came to power, Suharto, remained president until 1998, and during that time the killings could not be publicly debated. You see where I'm going here. Public debate, crucial to democracy. Textbooks attributed the attempted coup in Indonesia, in which 6 generals were killed, to the communists and said little about the subsequent torture, beheadings, and mutilations that were carried out by the military and army-affiliated militias who had been whipped up into an anti-communist hysteria. After the fall of Suharto in 1998, the floodgates flew open. Memoirs of imprisoned activists drew public attention, as did previously untranslated works in English about the events. Oral historians began collecting memories of the events. But reconciliation did not follow. In 2000, when a group devoted to exhuming the bodies of the murdered was filming on Java, a Muslim youth group stopped the reburial. The NU, a traditionalist Sunni Muslim organization, burned textbooks deemed pro-communist in 2007 rather than allow a projected textbook reform. In 2013, a museum celebrating Suharto's rule opened in his hometown. It was paid for by his brother, who had been convicted of corruption, and the displays justified the crackdown, saying nothing about the innocent people killed. Countless other examples might be cited of conflicts over memory and their role in efforts to democratize. But perhaps the most remarkable are the more than 30 truth commissions that have been established around the world since the early 1980s. Many different kinds of societies, from Guatemala to Thailand, have expressed the need for some kind of official mechanism to come to terms with past atrocities committed either during civil wars or under authoritarian governments. A truth commission is a kind of history hearing set up on the premise that the full truth about past murders, imprisonments, tortures, and discrimination must be told if the nation is to move forward. Most truth commissions have been explicitly modeled on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, set up by law at the end of 1995 in order to facilitate the transition from the apartheid regime to the democratic one. Because of its influence around the globe, the TRC has been the subject of extensive analysis and debate. This is not the place for a discussion of these many efforts. Most of them have been criticized as failing to accomplish their ends. These complaints should not obscure what seems to me a larger truth. The recovery of history has become important in virtually every instance of transition from one regime to another. Moreover, this desire to set the record straight is not limited to places transitioning from civil war to peace, from apartheid to black majority rule, or from military authoritarianism to elected civilian government. The history of supposedly stable nations, such as Japan, the United States, or Britain, is also in question because of elements that have been forgotten, effaced, or repressed, and are now coming to the surface. Historical truth may be essential to establishing and maintaining democracies, but disputes about that truth make it clear that the truth is far from self-evident. Even where general agreement exists, for example, on certain facts, the facts themselves can change if new sources or new methods become available. Take the example of Thomas Jefferson. For more than 150 years, historians debated whether President Thomas Jefferson, the chief author of the Declaration of Independence, had fathered children by one of his female slaves, Sally Hemings. The advent of DNA testing made a more definitive answer possible. And when that testing in 1998 made his paternity all but undeniable, a major shift in perspective was inevitable. The first major national exhibition to highlight a president's slaveholding activities took place at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in 2012. Well into the 1980s and 1990s, many exhibitions and living museums alike had either obfuscated the role of slavery or made it seem paternal and even benign. I do not mean to suggest that this one fact changed historians' treatment of slavery, but it was such an explosive fact that it did have repercussions. It raised new questions about Jefferson's stance on slavery, about the role of slavery in the new republic, and about white-black relations and the way they had been deliberately concealed in the past. Facts may change, but interpretations of facts are altogether more subject to dispute. Take any topic you like, and you will find that historians disagree about its interpretation, including, of course, why the Holocaust happened, not whether it happened. One of my favorite examples is Napoleon, shown here in one of many of Gilray's etchings. Needless to say, this is a negative view of Napoleon. Was he a great general, or just lucky enough to benefit from his opponent's weaknesses? Was he a monomaniac, or a clever pragmatist? Was he a visionary about Europe, or a land-grabbing imperialist? For many students, it is a shock to discover that the seemingly authoritative narratives they read in their school textbooks necessarily cover over endless such controversies. Since historians always write from points of view that are shaped by their personal histories and social contexts, their accounts cannot claim to be entirely objective. But having a standpoint does not make a history untrue. The truest history is often written by people with deep commitments on one side or another of an issue. Blandness is not the same thing as truth. The greatest historians have been passionate about their quest. The French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville wrote what is still the single most influential interpretation of the French Revolution, in English called rather blandly The Old Regime and the French Revolution, published in 1856, because he was horrified by the rise to power in his own time of Napoleon's lymphatic nephew, as he called him, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. How could the French repeatedly give up their newfound liberties for a form of democratic despotism? What was the appeal of the Bonapartes? To find answers Tocqueville went to the official archives of his region and studied in detail the operation of the French monarchy in the 1700s. He became convinced that the monarchy itself had paved the way for the first Bonaparte by destroying the political powers of the nobility and local estates. Tocqueville's passion for the subject propelled him to the archives. His literary skill made his interpretation into a classic that endures. Tocqueville's claims to historical truth are based on the core standards that are widely accepted among historians. The truthfulness of any interpretation depends on its coherence and its ability to offer an explanation for the important facts. A coherent account is logical. It cites evidence that is germane and does not draw irrational conclusions from that evidence. If I want to argue, for example, that Napoleon considered a paternalistic relationship to women and children essential to his brand of authoritarian regime, I will look for evidence in his laws, writings, and even his personal life. But I cannot maintain that the fact that he loved his wife shows he was paternalistic. Such a conclusion does not follow logically. He could have loved his wife and favored any number of different regimes. More is required, however, than coherence. To be as complete an explanation as possible, my emphasis on Napoleon's paternalistic attitude must make sense of as many applicable facts as possible. It does not need to explain his battlefield strategy, but it must account for articles in his law codes concerning women and children, and even perhaps his personal attitudes, though these might have differed from those expressed in official pronouncements. The fact that under Napoleon's law code a wife could not acquire property, contract a debt, work, or make a will without her husband's consent would be a strong piece of evidence for my argument. A critic could still object that Napoleon did not draw up the laws on his own. But though Napoleon did not act alone, he did personally supervise many of the sessions that rewrote family law. An interpretation cannot rely only on the facts that fit. It has to stand the test of possible counter-arguments, and thus dialogue, public sphere, democratic interchange. Although the close connection between facts and interpretations inevitably raises doubts about historical truth, it also creates constant incentives for more research to resolve those doubts. When my hypothetical critic objects that Napoleon did not write the laws by himself, I am forced to dig deeper and find more evidence of his participation and of his collaborators' understanding of his views. In this way, interpretive disputes produce more facts, and previous interpretations, facts, and debates about them do not disappear from view. They provide the foundation for future work. Even when a historical interpretation is based on true facts, is logically coherent, and as complete as a scholar can make it, the truth of that interpretation remains provisional. New facts can be discovered, and the benchmark for completeness shifts over time. Historians have long propped up national cohesion by providing narratives of a nation's supposedly distinctive identity over time. Reading those accounts now reveals an incompleteness unrecognized at the time. This blinkering effect of patriotism is not limited to Europe or the West. It occurs everywhere. Yet before we complacently feel superior to these past efforts, we should recognize that one day our histories will look just as incomplete. For 2 centuries, the standard accounts of United States history began with a nod to Columbus, and then dug in with the establishment of English colonies after the failed first effort at Jamestown in 1607. Although the French and Spanish held much larger tracts of land, historians justified their focus on the English by arguing that the English language and the English political and legal institutions shaped the country most profoundly. Native Americans, or Indians as they were called, were largely dismissed. In his popular textbook, An American History, published in multiple editions between 1911 and 1933, David Muzzy did not hesitate to denigrate the North American tribes, and along with them, the contemporary African American population. Just one short quote: "They, had a great variety of games and dances, solemn and gay, and they loved to bask idly in the sun too, like the Mississippi Negro of today, end quote. He considered his account coherent and complete, without devoting serious attention to Native or African Americans. Muzzy nonetheless found himself accused, even then, of writing a treason text because he did not write positively enough about the founding fathers of the new republic. Do these few examples show that historical truth is impossible? Although they do indicate that absolute truth is impossible, a closer look reveals that the standards of historical truth are incredibly powerful because they facilitate criticism. Have all the relevant facts been considered? Is an explanation, for example, of American identity complete if it ignores the contributions of the French, Spanish, Native Americans, or African Americans? Is a history of Britain entirely coherent if it fails to take account of the Welsh perspective? Historical interpretations are by their nature fragile constructions, always subject to new discoveries and new notions of completeness. The same techniques that were used to reinforce ethnic or national identity and create a sense of Western superiority can also be used to challenge the ethnic or national narratives and undermine the Western sense of superiority. That's what I mean by powerful. In the end, those who wish to contest national narratives, like those who may wish to contest the validity of new historical methods, must all rely on the same standards of historical truth that have been evolving since the early 19th century. Well, and one could say for centuries before that as well. If there is no agreed upon standard, and I'm talking about implicit agreement here, then there is no way of determining the truth about the past, however provisional. Indeed, there would be no way of even having a debate about that truth. To debate, two or more sides have to agree on the rules for debate. This is a subject I think we maybe need to devote a little bit more attention to. And to win a debate is to make better arguments. If an argument can be improved or disproved, then there is an implicit standard of proof. Discussion and debate are vital because they allow movement in the definition of completeness and encourage those who study history, for example, to continue uncovering facts that will change interpretations of the past. They fuel the ongoing democratization of history and history's contribution to democracy. Winning the debate about an interpretation is not really the point. Having the debate is. Discovering and marshaling evidence and developing interpretations that are as truthful as possible is essential to a vibrant public debate, whether about the role of an autocratic ruler like Napoleon I or III, about the role of an ethnic group in the nation's identity over time, or the place we occupy in the world. The truth will always be provisional, but the very idea of an ever-contested and even ever-changing truth is crucial to a democratic society. Thank you.
I'd like to invite a question from the audience.
Chandra.
Thanks so much for a really riveting talk.
Riveting.
You started out by talking about there being too much knowledge, and then you moved in to talk about how important and essential evidence was for establishing valid claims about the past. Could you say a little bit more about how the legitimate views of history get mediated to the public and how they eventually rise to become the reigning interpretation, how they cut through the deluge of knowledge that we're getting through so many sources?
Right.
What are the mechanisms?
Right. That's an absolutely great question, and I'm sure you can answer it every bit as well as I can, but I'll give it a shot. Yes. So you're pointing to a tension there that I think is a really interesting tension. There's more and more knowledge available. And so my point there was, we are therefore more and more dependent on those who can explain to us what the knowledge means and amounts to. And that is where I think there is a big room for the kinds of skepticism that we have seen, even sort of disabling skepticism, because because no one is in a position to know everything about everything. So this creates an enormous amount of space for skepticism about what the interpreter is telling you about what it means, since you are probably not in a position to go out and verify the evidence. So that's where you brought up the evidence. And this is why I believe that it is still the case, though I believe in interdisciplinarity. I've also always believed that it only works if you have disciplinarity to start with. So the disciplines are basically teaching the interpreters how to make sense of the evidence in that particular field. And the reason there's been so much specialization is because there is more and more knowledge. So none of us can pretend to be a Rousseau who could write operas and political treatises at the same time, or a Diderot who could write about incredibly difficult philosophical questions and pornography on the side. We don't have that kind of command of the knowledge field, or even any possible pretense to it. Well, maybe Steven Pinker has a pretense to it more than others, but there are a few examples perhaps, but not very many. So the disciplines are incredibly important, but it has created, in that sense, a kind of paradox, which is specialization is inevitable because of the increase in knowledge. The interpreters are essential. This creates room for skepticism, and it also means that there has been an increasing distance between the university, which is teaching these disciplines, and the general public, compared to, let's say, any time before the end of the 19th century, really. In the 19th century, as you well know, historians wrote very popular pieces. In many cases, for the most part, the professionalization of history removed it from that popular audience increasingly. I think now we're in a period of, and this is what this conference is about, of rethinking that relationship. So Martine's presentation, I thought, was incredibly important in showing that there are even new ways that the university can make a contribution to public dialogue that aren't the old disciplinary structures, but are, in a sense, the creation of new fields. But he does train students in how to do the things that they are doing, and what they need to know to be able to do it well. So I think we're in this situation where there is a tension between the amount of knowledge and how we have to organize to be able to make use of that knowledge, and the ability to explain it to the public. I mean, when I was a graduate student, which was a very long time ago, admittedly, but it was within living memory, at least of myself, I remember going to my first lectures at Stanford, given by an extremely famous historian. He was a really great historian, and other historians, and no one paid any attention to whether the lectures were boring or not. I mean, literally, it didn't matter. You were a great teacher. You were there to teach graduate students, and what you taught the undergraduates in the lectures, well, too bad for them. There just wasn't that much interest. At least in the university, there's more interest in whether you can teach, which didn't used to be the case, frankly, until about the last 10 or 15 years. So we're now, I think, in a kind of revision of the relationship to the public. And the question is how to do that. Because as you know, in history, if you write things that are really popular, it's really hard to keep the balance between, kind of having done a lot of research and found as much new information as possible and reaching a popular audience. It is possible to do, however. Take, for example, the biography of Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro. Now, it's true, it's a multi-volume work, but it's actually riveting because he knows how to write. He's not a university historian, it has to be said. So we need to learn from people who are better public communicators. But I think the tension, my basic bottom line is that the tension doesn't mean that truth has gone away. It just means that explaining how it works requires more work.
Rachel?
Yeah, well, I love what you're saying about interdisciplinarity, but I want to pick up on it for the academy and not just the public. So I'm a historian. I was recently invited to a conversation about markets with a bunch of economists, mostly, and a few political scientists, many of whom were very conservative. And when I read the assigned readings that they gave me, many of these very conservative economists do history, right? And they're in the way they interpret whether or not we should be caring about a category like liberty. And I was kind of horrified, actually, by the methodology that was used in the history. And I was distressed, and I kept thinking, well, I mean, I want to be able to have more of these interdisciplinary conversations. And so there was for instance, an example about the progressive movement that was just blatantly wrong. And I brought this up to the attention of the people there, and they just looked at me kind of dumbstruck. Like, no, they were just taking it for granted that this was correct. And I thought to myself, your comment about democracy is based upon public conversations and debate. I wonder sometimes about the narrowness of our academic conversations, that this seemed so outside of their ken, they couldn't even fathom that this could be wrong. And I thought, why aren't we talking more? Why aren't we having more of these conversations? Right. I mean, I'm sure I need to be challenged in the way I think about markets too, but clearly there needed to be some historical intervention here. So I just love to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, so I think that is happening. My only cautionary note was that I think these conversations are best when people have been trained in a discipline and can bring a kind of perspective to the conversation rather than trying to do several things at the same time equally, which I think is quite difficult to do. Like, I have always tried to do myself interdisciplinary work. It's gotten me into a little bit of trouble, but actually, interestingly, mainly with the people in my own home field. So I use, for example, literature a lot, and painting a lot, and engraving a lot in my work. And actually, the literary people and the art historians are quite happy to hear that it's important, that I think it's important, that, you know, in other words, that they have a historical effect. It's not just a kind of superstructure on important events, but that it actually has an effect. Whereas the historians are like, you know, what do you think you're doing? How can you, talk about novels and paintings in that particular kind of way? But so these are, they're very subtle questions. I've always felt that I've gotten away with it because I push the envelope just enough without like making people beside themselves with rage, just kind of irritated enough to write a book review or whatever. So it's a complicated question on how those interchanges work best. But I think it's part of I think one of the things that the whole group has been talking about is how to make all of this more real to the public so that people can understand why we do what we do, not to stop doing what we're doing, but to understand why we do it the way we do it. So, I mean, I do think it's true, for example, that there's been an enormous amount of blowback about what U.S. historians have done with U.S. history. Now, for example, everybody does things on France and Spain when they talk about early America. They no longer talk about as if the colonies on the eastern seaboard were all there was in the landmass. The Florida didn't belong to Spain, and the French didn't have large amounts of territory to the north at a certain point, and that there weren't massively important Native American groups. All that has changed, I think, truly dramatically, but it takes a while for the public to get used to that. I mean, it's only been in the last 30 years that Native American history was even taught in elementary school. Now I think almost every state in the country probably teaches Native American history in, 4th grade, 5th grade, the Native Americans of your part of the country, because basically almost every part of the country has Native Americans. I grew up in Minnesota, and there's still big Indian reservations in Minnesota. But now this is considered totally normal. Whereas when I was growing up, we never heard about Native Americans. I didn't even know there were Native Americans until I started eating wild rice. Found out it was all harvested by the Native Americans of Minnesota.
Rebecca? Sure, thank you. And I think my question is related to exactly what's being talked about here, particularly both kind of within the academy and also kind of the dichotomy we're seeing, just we're simplifying basically, obviously, between the academy and the public. But you said at the beginning of the talk that the idea of truth that is provisional is less emotionally satisfying. And you didn't use the word emotion again. You did mention rationality a couple of times when you're talking about kind of the standards for historical methodology. And so I wondered if you could say more about who or for whom provisional truth is less emotionally satisfying, or what you mean there by emotionally satisfying.
Well, what I'm saying is I think it's less emotionally satisfying for everyone. Because we, though you may not know it, we have lived a long history in the West of absolutism. And this, even, let's say, even someone like Kant, who is not a political absolutist or a religious absolutist, is still, philosophy was still very much occupied with, can we have an absolutely, Descartes, an absolutely sure foundation. So I think it's just in us all that it would be, that we just have a kind of built-in desire to be certain. And so what I'm trying to say is that I think we all understand rationally that scientific truth is based on probabilities. Okay, yes, there are maybe some laws, that's even increasingly in question, but whether they absolutely apply all the time everywhere. Einstein, after all, improved on Newton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we change our view of what exactly those laws are and how they operate. But we want that kind of certainty. So science in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 18th century was basically scientists, they didn't call themselves scientists, but natural philosophers were saying, this is the new absolute truth based on the study of the laws of nature. And we have a very hard time, even though we know that it's a question of probabilities and provisionality, and that we're going to be revising what we think, and that we keep discovering new things, and there are yet new elements that are being discovered, for example, in the world of atomic particles. It's hard for us to sort of say, okay, that's good enough, because it leaves so much uncertain. It means that things are going to change in the future. So I think it is just, so that's what I meant by emotionally satisfying. Now, emotions, I think, are actually an incredibly important part of all of this, because the whole point of national histories has been in the past to create this sense of national belonging. And there's an enormous amount of dispute amongst professional historians about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I myself actually think it is important to have a national narrative and a sense of national belonging, but that it turns out we can change it. You can make it much more that all kinds of people have contributed. We now have a new national narrative, after all, which is the multicultural narrative, that America is exceptional because it's been able to bring in all these different people. And I think, these things are always in the process of change, and I think that fact that it's only provisional is just harder to take. You don't think so? You think it's...
I was going to follow up, but I want to give other people a
I
chance.
could follow up, but I think Matt had the question.
Okay.
I'll catch you next conference.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, well, I fear I might be changing the direction of the conversation.
That's all right.
But, so I was interested in this idea that you floated toward the end, that without standards, there's no possibility for debate. And I was interested in this in part because this was an idea that was very popular in the philosophy of science in like the 30s, more or less. Mm-hmm. And the principal difficulty with this idea these philosophers discovered is that there can also be debates about which standards are the appropriate ones. Sure. So you gave us a list of, coherence and consistency. I like those standards very much. What if what if another historian has different standards? Do you need sort of meta-level standards to adjudicate that dispute, right. Or how would you think about that?
Well, right. I mean, that's an incredibly important question, and I couldn't possibly give it an entirely satisfying answer, because this is a subject of ongoing debate, and this is the big issue. It seems to me that in our joint conversations that we haven't entirely dealt with, which is the whole notion of a civil dialogue as part of as an important civic project rests on agreeing on certain things. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the really troubling thing in the world today is people who absolutely do not want to be part of that and are willing to blow it up because they have a different view. And exactly what we're going to do about that remains, I think, very much an issue. Mm-hmm. Because so far we have tried very much to kind of broaden the conversation without losing the sense of the underlying foundations of the conversation. That logic matters, that coherence matters, that completeness matters, that taking account of the evidence matters, and that having verifiable evidence matters. These are all derived from this so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century, no question about it. But my argument is they're still pretty powerful, and I don't see a better set out there that would enable us to live the kind of life that we want to live. In other words, with a certain amount of division, but a reasonable amount of harmony. I mean, I think the thing we're aiming for is a society which can continue to have enough cohesion to allow a vibrant debate without falling apart at the seams. That's what we're worried about right now, is that it's going to fall apart at the seams. So I'm trying to say, the fact that we have debates is, it seems to me, inherently a good thing, including about the standards. Now, those debates tend to take place, as you well know, since you're in that field, in, philosophical circles where not a whole lot of the population really understands the arguments that are going on.
Or cares, yes.
Right, or cares. But they care when it comes into this, more into this sort of like, how do you tell the story of the United States? What's the right way to do it? And how do we decide what the right way to do it is? And I'm saying, I think the fact that we can have that debate shows that we do have certain shared standards. And that's why I said the historians won the culture war, even though they lost all the particular skirmishes. They had to withdraw the standards, etc. Oh, sorry, no, it's me.
I thought we had another question.
Yes.
Just a theological question that I think people do care about, at least in Christian circles, about the quest of the historical Jesus. In effect, I think we know more about Jesus than any previous generation because we know more about his context. And this has effect on what people believe about the identity of Jesus. So I'd like your thoughts just on that quest of the historical Jesus and its various iterations.
Well, this was, historically it was an incredibly important part of the kind of undoing of absolutisms. Okay? I mean, when the first things came out on the life of Jesus in the 19th century, there was an enormous amount of controversy about what this meant. It did not mean, and I must be clear on this, when I say we have a hard time getting rid of absolutism, I don't mean that we're trying to move towards a system in which there is no religious belief. That is not what I'm saying. It's the question of its place in the world and how it operates. So the historical Jesus was very much part of saying he's a historical figure, which means that other religious figures were also historical figures, and that you could understand them all within a kind of common historical context, even if it wasn't the exact same century. Though with Jesus it was the same century for some other important religious figures, and that this was an incredibly important move towards saying we all live in the same world, and how do we navigate our living together? So it seems to me that the historical Jesus did not mean the end of belief, but it meant a kind of different way of seeing the place of belief in the world. Because this is one of the key issues. I'm assuming that most of us believe it is better to live in a world in which we let people believe whatever belief they want to believe religiously, as long as they're willing to participate in sort of certain common ground rules for the political order and the social order. And that is an extremely important part of the society that we live in. And that was an incredibly long and difficult struggle.
Yes.
You sort of challenged us to push you on your view of the Statue of Liberty.
Yes. Okay, so I think this is a super interesting thing, and that's why I wanted to bring up sort of from my own field, the French Revolution. Of course, I'm extremely proud of the fact that the French revolutionaries, of course, they did a huge amount of damage, but they also, in the process, sort of said, wait, are we really going to destroy everything from the past in order to create the new order? And so they create the museum as a way of saying, well, no, we'll turn it into something else, and we don't have to just destroy it. We can actually go look at it in a different way. So I think that's actually a key to our current situation, which is what is the status of the monument. So I think the American Historical Association did exactly the right thing, which was to say there is no way of making a blanket statement about Confederate monuments. Each one has to be studied historically. In terms of, we can't just say they inevitably represent just oppression, or that they represent inevitably a kind of important artistic statement. We have to look at each one and get at, so for example, in the case of Robert E. Lee, I think it's actually quite ambiguous, because it's actually, as I understand, somebody else may have read this more recently than I have, it was actually commissioned by a northerner who was not particularly pro-slavery, or it was commissioned by a Southerner, a woman, but the artist is actually from the North, who was not at all a sort of pro-slavery artist. So I think one needs to sit down and look at, who did it, why did they do it, what was it meant to mean, what does it mean now, what should we do about that? I think these are very complicated issues, and that's why I brought up the point about tearing down the statue of George III. People do things at certain moments for reasons that have to do with emotion rather than studying the context of the situation. And sometimes that can't be entirely avoided. Should all the Stalin and Lenin statues have been kept in museums? I don't know. I think those especially giant ones probably deserved to go. Because their giantness, to me, means something in and of itself. But all I'm saying is that this is, the way to have a debate about it is to actually develop some evidence, as opposed to saying we know what it means.
Yes.
Actually, reading Mike's paper, which I think you're presenting tomorrow, brought back some personal memories of me of reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States.
Sure.
Somewhere around undergrad. And I know it wasn't a sign. I
Right.
think someone put it. So I'm curious from a kind of professional historian perspective, the impact of that book, the methods of that book. I mean, I don't know too much about. I mean, it certainly got us thinking in different ways.
Right.
I'm curious
Right.
what the thoughts are.
Well, that's the thing about debate, is that it's not, that was a book that got people thinking about, and this is, I think, extremely important and actually incredibly hard to do when you do this professionally, which is to kind of, professional training means learning how people did it in the past and up to the very moment when you're doing it. And it's very hard to rethink the kind of structure, the interpretive structure, when you spent all your time learning how everybody did it before and how to do it the way they did it. And when you're a graduate student and you're writing a dissertation and you're worried about whether somebody's going to show that you're a complete fool, it makes it very hard to rethink the whole picture, which is why such books are usually written by older people. Not really old people, but kind of medium-aged people.
I mean, I don't really know much about him. I mean, was he a professional historian?
Yeah. But he was also, he was a radical and, a self-described leftist, and he wanted to, really fight the whole thing. But in some ways, sometimes the work is politically motivated, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's because of ethnic reasons. There are all different kinds of reasons that might enter in, but you can have the debate based on how good is the evidence? Yeah. How complete is the explanation? Does it make sense? And sometimes getting us to think differently is in itself important, even if you're not completely satisfied with everything else about it. So he left out various things in order to make his points. But sometimes that's a good part of the debate. So are you all beaten into complete objection here? Aaron?
So apologies for a question that's probably too direct and too broad, but you have been poking at what I think is kind of the anxiety at the heart of this conference for me, which is that truths that are proximate and provisional and always in need of revision will always feel a little less satisfying than truths that are simple and direct and easily believed by a broad swath of people. So, in a negative sense, maybe my question or my fear is, what are the chances for success? Especially in a discipline that is always kind of, sort of elliptically coming back around to the same things. And maybe in a positive sense, what are some tools for making attractive a truth that is always provisional and always under revision, maybe particularly in the classroom?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a kind of a separate question. And it's also it's not just about history, because we're actually talking more generally about the public sphere in general. And there actually, in some ways, there's a lot of room to be, of course, I am from Minnesota, so a Pollyanna mentality kind of goes with that. There are a lot of reasons to be optimistic, not just the kinds of things that Martine is talking about having actually accomplished, but also there has been a humongous explosion of interest in questions. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard Russia discussed so much on television news ever before. I mean, so people are actually want to know. So there's been an enormous amount of writing about, what is happening, why it's happening, what does it mean. The revelations about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and now Science Magazine is publishing articles that are studies on fake news. I mean, there's been an enormous upsurge of desire to figure out what it means, which I think is extremely positive and fits very much with the notion of provisional understanding, that people are scrambling to figure out what does it mean, and is our version of populism the same as what's going on in Eastern Europe especially, but to a certain extent in Western Europe as well, and other parts of the world. Does this have, if it's a worldwide movement, is it really right to think of it in terms of American causes? Maybe we should be thinking in broader causes. People, enormously smart people in various fields are now busily writing books on precisely these issues. So I think actually there's enormous reason to be optimistic, because people do want to know, and they do want to know what it means that it is possible to manipulate opinion in the way that it has been manipulated. So yes, and so I don't think it's the teaching question. I think is in some ways the hardest. I was thinking very much with the wonderful session that we had about teaching earlier today with the 4 people here from Westmont College. I have to confess, my thing was, you people have no idea how much you are accomplishing just because you have small classes. I teach history classes to 150 to 250 students. I mean, and I teach 1715 to the present, Western civilization, in 10 weeks. Well, it is really hard to get into the controversies. I mean, it's really hard to even say, there's actually a lot of division of opinion on the French Revolution, Napoleon, Marxism, ideologies, nationalism, socialism. I mean, it's really hard to do that. So the context really matters in that sense. The small liberal arts college has a very privileged place in terms of our intellectual life for that reason. It is, the names of your students. You actually grade their papers. This is an incredibly important, just by the sheer structure of it, you accomplish enormous things that are possible, that are much harder for adjuncts teaching 7 courses in different places, being taught, given $2,000 or $3,000 a course. I have a student who teaches at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. He's a really great guy, Eric Johnson. He teaches 500 students a semester with no TAs. So guess what he does? He does a fair amount of multiple choice tests. He was totally opposed to multiple choice tests. What do you think he's going to do? Grade 500 papers? It's actually not physically possible. He has 4 courses a semester and he's expected to teach as many as 500 students a semester. I mean, it's just crazy. The real problem is what has happened to the educational structure more generally. The small liberal arts colleges, the high-ranking research universities still are able to do certain kinds of things. It's much harder. There are fantastic people teaching in places like community colleges, and they actually can accomplish something because they have relatively small courses. But the big public universities, it's really hard to do this. So much has to do with, we've tried to invent freshman seminars, for example, so that students can get some sense of this. But if you're doing these kinds of giant, and I was talking to Marianne before, the Europeans, you think we have a problem. The European problem is infinitely worse, where there are massive classes. France, Germany, Italy, all these places have massive classes. Students don't even read the books. This is why people come to this country. Because what we do in terms of education is still so exciting for people in the rest of the world who never get any sense that you can actually sit and talk to your professor. Amazing.
Yes.
So you've raised a question that I wondered about. So have universities become too large? I mean, do we now have, in effect, a very dysfunctional system? It's great at research and training a few people at research. But like you were saying, if you have 60,000 students at your university, you can't get to know them. So do we need to sort of rethink the nature of the university to try and sort of utilize the virtues, say, of a small liberal arts college, do we need to sort of split up these large institutions? Have we gone about it all wrong?
Yeah, it's going to be very hard to do that, as my suspicion. So
When you say hard, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
When you say hard, is it that we're just used to this and nobody wants to do it?
No, I mean politically, in the sense that the universities are being starved. All the public universities are being starved. Every single public university, I think, with very, very, very few exceptions, is getting less and less and less and less monies from state legislatures, because the same phenomenon is going on all over Western Europe, which is there's a kind of distrust of the university, dislike of the university, even amongst those people who graduated from the universities and benefited from the universities. So there's a kind of unwillingness to put money into this.
Right.
I mean, California is like a incredibly important example of this. On the other hand, it's not clear to me that, so I'm not clear to me they're going to give you money to change the current situation. So right now it seems to me what we have to do is have more, there is much more attention to teaching than before, and there is much more attention even in the big universities to trying to get situations in which students can be in smaller classes. Because frankly, just having a smaller class changes everything. It really changes everything. So for us, even if it's TAs and they're in a section of 18 or 20, it's a lot better than just sitting in the intro to psychology with us has 400 students and 1 TA. At least in most fields we have still got TAs for one for every 20 students. They have 3 sections of 20 students, but they can talk to them. And also just putting more emphasis on that. So when I have 150 or 250 students, I have various techniques that I use to try to be in contact with them. Of course, email helps. I'm, in the class, but I also, when I go into my class, I immediately talk to 5 students, find out their names, ask them where they're from, ask them what they like about the university or don't like about the university, and try to give them the sense that actually I see them. So there are things that you can do to make this better. Because I don't think they're going to give us a lot of money to break into smaller units.
Actually, some of the impulse of having smaller classes is because you're not getting money from the state, so now you're competing for students.
Right.
And giving students that liberal arts experience.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And that's a big selling point. We use this freshman seminar thing as a huge selling point, and we have this cluster program which I taught in, which was meant to get students a sense of belonging. And so that, the institutions are trying to adjust to what is a difficult situation. But like I said, when I was a student, the fact that a lecture was boring, it was like, too bad for you. Now that is really not true.
Yes, there was a question.
Well, I think another thing is, it's kind of strange because politicians also talk about sort of improving access and increasing access to higher education.
Right.
So the numbers don't work. This isn't going to happen because we'd have to increase the size of the professorate by at least 5, 6, probably 10-fold,
right,
just to make those numbers work. So that's not going to happen. So part of the problem is they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're starving you,
right,
but they're also telling you to take more students.
Right. Right. Well, and the fact is, this is something I'm super interested in, so I've actually looked at the data. The great thing that the U.S. system developed in the post-war era was an incredible increase in access to students. To students, which meant more social classes and eventually more races. And this is still happening. We are actually still increasing the percentage of high school graduates every year. The increase is not as big, but it has actually not gone in the other direction. And I think this is, democratic societies depend upon having an educated population precisely so that they can make sense of these questions, for example, about truth. So this seems to me very, very important. And it's not accidental that every other country in the world has copied this recipe. The reason the European universities are in such trouble is that they have tried to increase the number of students without increasing the infrastructure of the university at all since the 1970s.
I think another thing that we do well is we have multiple access points.
Right. Oh, God, yes. God, yes. And we also have competition.
And the community colleges are a huge part of that infrastructure. It's really very important.
And the private-public competition has been an incredible advantage in the U.S. system. I am a big believer in state control of things, but I have to say when I compare the European situation of top-down national education ministries and almost entirely state schools. With our system, with competition, the reason state schools even have any hope is that we can constantly say, look what people are doing at Harvard and Yale and Columbia. Don't you want us to be like that? And if there weren't a Harvard, Yale, and Columbia or whatever, or small liberal arts colleges that offer this kind of intense education, we would have no hope of making the argument. So it's an incredible advantage.
Right.
You're one of my heroes for using, the way you use truth so positively. The Appleby book and yours was, I think, great. But you're in the use of truth and in seeing this sort of democratization of it, I just have a question for you. A phrase that I hear a lot as a historian is the creation of a usable past.
Right.
I just was wondering what you think of that phrase. Is there a danger to that at all? Or what do you think? You like that phrase, the creation of a usable past?
Well, see, the reason I think it's still great that we have disciplines in the university and departments and things like that is that I think it's really important to have a range of possibilities. So like, I think it's great to have popular histories. Anything that gets anybody interested in history, as far as I'm concerned. I've completely changed my attitude towards historical reenactment, for example. You want to be a historical reenactor? That's great, because then you actually care. What did people wear? Et cetera. So, right now I'm into reading, for example, Horatio Hornblower, which is a great favorite of 12-year-old boys. Something that, of course, as a 12-year-old girl, I would never have touched. Because, there are different ways to get people interested in history. And so I think but it's really important to have the professional side, because then you have people who are constantly producing new knowledge and new perspectives, and it takes a while for that to make its way into the textbooks, and then it takes a while for it to make its way more generally into kind of historical writing. And that's the way it is. But I think it's really great to have all of those different entry points. So I think the growth of historical museums and heritage places is fantastic. Used to be that professional historians would be said, well, it's not really the correct interpretation, but I think that people are giving that up now and realizing that it's great if people are interested.
So you're pro Hamilton?
Of course. I happened to be in New York almost at the beginning of Hamilton. I paid a fortune and went to Hamilton, and I loved it. However, the person I went with did not like it as much as I did.
Yeah, I was just going to share, we're talking about breaking up some larger state universities, some reimagining of what the university and the academy could look like. So one of the things that's interesting that California is doing, again, we're kind of reimagining what the master plan for the state would look like, allowing the CSUs to start issuing EDDs, kind of encroaching on the UC system. The UC is kind of pushing back. But then there's the community colleges that they're now going through the access pilot program. So they've authorized 12 colleges to issue bachelor's degrees. There's 113 colleges in community colleges in California, each of which could apply to begin a bachelor's degree program if the pilots are successful. So I think of some place like Santa Barbara City College, right, recently named, whether you agree or not, right, the best community college in the United States by the Aspen Institute. Most of their adjunct faculty are shared with UCSB. They could do a bachelor's degree program. In fact, they applied, but they were passed over. But so that's a possibility that we will have 100 more state universities, state colleges in California issuing bachelor's degrees. So I don't know if that's on everybody's radar that we were discussing that, but that's something that's being discussed. I know Florida has done that, allowed 2-year universities to begin issuing baccalaureate degrees as a way of access, and predominantly towards the professional degrees, not necessarily more heavily researched, but freeing up space, hopefully, in the UC system for students who actually want to pursue research intensive or etc.
Right.
So relieving the pressure on
Right.
the UC system, and also, frankly, going after some of the proprietary institutions, right? So Phoenix is moving in aggressively to
Right.
fill that's right there, so.
Right. Yes, no, I'm much more worried about the for-profit so-called online. I teach an online course, so I'm not opposed to online teaching at all. I love my online course that I teach every summer. But this particular for-profit online thing, I think, is quite worrisome. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot depends on each individual case, and there are many community colleges by us, for example, Pasadena City College and Santa Monica City College are fantastically good places. We get fantastically good students from them. I mean, I would be sorry not to have, we have a huge ratio of transfer students at UCLA. It's almost half of the incoming class is transfer students, and that I've found that the transfer students are especially good, frankly. They frequently have had to work, they've gone to school later, they are in some ways more dedicated than your sort of standard middle class white family producing students who kind of weren't sure what they wanted to do and kind of come to us and are like, whereas the community college students are like, I have to finish because I can't afford to come for more than this amount of time, and they're really interested and motivated.
Well, at the same time, the community college system, well, and as you know, overall, this idea of what the master plan is.
Yes.
They're reframing, I heard a college president or superintendent reframe it as community colleges over the years have gone through various understandings of what community access means. So going away again from the all-you-can-eat knowledge cafe to a conveyor belt. So the student success initiative saying,
right.
You're in, what is your education goal, you're out.
Right.
So yes, somebody who's re-entering the workforce should be able to come in, but what's the education goal? And then if you add a bachelor's degree program in an institution that may not have that legacy or that background. So anyways.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, it's complicated. There are a lot of problems with certain community colleges and how they have worked. And many of them have been fundamentally changed by the job market, which has brought incredibly talented people into community colleges. But not all of them have been changed in the same way. So it's a complicated system. But think of it, a state that has 113 community colleges. I mean, and the number of state universities, Cal States there are, that are often incredibly fantastic. I mean, it's an amazing accomplishment.
We have another question.
Yes.
In view of your comment about Hamilton,
yes,
I have to say that if my grown children were here who took our family about 2 years ago to see Hamilton, paid a fortune, I wrote a criticism of it on my blog. They all unsubscribed, my children. Because I said they would ask this question to use it against me because you like Hamilton. I liked Hamilton too in many ways. The poetry was fantastic. But at the same time, I characterized it as a reverse minstrel show, where you had black and Hispanic people playing the parts of the oppressors of their ancestors and using the revolutionary medium of hip-hop to support the official story of the United States and to obscure the fact that Hamilton and Jefferson were not the people that our standard histories present them to be.
Well, actually, Hamilton and Jefferson, now there you've touched a nerve. First of all, Hamilton is mixed race. I mean, and he's from the Caribbean. And so he's a super interesting character. So that he named it after Hamilton, I thought was genius, precisely for this reason. And Jefferson, is just an incredibly complicated and ambiguous figure. So yes, he had children. We now are almost positive, 98% positive, that he had children by Sally Hemings. Yes, that is true. It's also true that he had slaves. It's also true that he was in favor of the abolition, actually, of the slave trade. As in 1806, 1807, when the British proposed this, he was completely in favor of it. He was extremely kind of agitated on the subject of slavery, which is more than can be said for a lot of other people at the time. So I think actually Hamilton and Jefferson are two of the truly most interesting characters of this period of our history, because they had very complicated views. And after all, Jefferson had views that people thought were just, he would have been thought of as a communist even later. I mean, he was very radical in many of his views. He had problematic views, but he was also he was a true thinker in the sense that he thought through. And you're interested in theology. I mean, the Jefferson Bible. It's just an unbelievable idea. I mean, I actually had a student once who wrote an honors thesis on the Jefferson Bible because he was so intrigued by the fact that he would try to cut out the parts that he thought didn't fit with his rational notion of what the Bible should be like. I mean, so it's incredible. I mean, the point is, the guy was an amazing amazing figure. So I thought that was exactly what was interesting about Hamilton, is that it mixed everything up. It showed that, you know, you could just throw everything up in the air and have it come down and create all kinds of really interesting, bizarre juxtapositions of the people playing, precisely because the people didn't fit. It also pointed out that's what theater is supposed to be. You're not supposed to play yourself. So it actually created issues about ethnicity, I thought, that were super interesting for that reason.
My children, thank you.
Any further questions?
Oh, you have been so patient. You have been so patient. I know if you're like me, I'm at least standing up. If you're like me, sitting all day, your knees are going, and your entire body is beginning to rebel.
So perhaps we finish with Hamilton. That's a good way to finish. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.